Welcome back to another episode of the Taiwanology podcast. This is your host, Kwangyin from CommonWealth magazine. Today I'm very happy because we have an old friend in the studio, which we're going to introduce later in the show. We have two very special guests joining us today to discuss the Burning Man of human rights activism, which is RightsCon. That'll be taking place in late February in Taipei. That is in a few weeks. For this topic, we have two perfect guests from Access Now, the genius behind RightsCon. Access Now is a nonprofit organization dedicated to defending and expanding digital rights for individuals and communities at risk. Since its founding in 2009, Access Now has been advocating for issues such as digital security, freedom of expression, and privacy in the face of increasing technological challenges. So let me introduce the two guests today. First is Raman Singh, Chima. He is the Senior International Counsel and Asia Pacific Policy Director at Access Now, where he also serves as Global Cybersecurity Lead. An ex-Googler, Raman has also co-founded India's SaveTheInternet.in campaign for net neutrality and the Internet Freedom Foundation. He made the list of Forbes magazine's 30 under 30 in India under the law and policy category. Which year was that, Raman?
Are you trying to get me to reveal my age? But I don't know. So long ago, I nearly forgotten. I think 2016.
Oh, okay. It's not too long ago. You're still young. Don't worry. And also with us in the studio is Jason Liu. He is an award-winning journalist who has reported from different corners of the globe. And he also happens to be a good friend of mine. We have encountered on so many different occasions, usually at journalism award ceremonies, where he would always bring home the prize while I leave empty-handed. Right? No. It happens many times. So in this episode, we'll discuss the upcoming RightsCon event, which will bring together thousands of activists, policymakers, and tech leaders to address critical issues surrounding human rights in the digital age. And something I want to highlight is that considering Taiwan's unique geopolitical position, we're looking forward to exploring how this event will shape the conversation around digital rights in the region and beyond. So welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming in. First of all, I would like to start with the basic question. So what is Access Now and what is RightsCon? What are your objectives?
Sure. So Access Now exists because of a fundamental realization that we had. Many of the folks who got Access Now together 15 years ago realized that technology is incredibly empowering, incredibly liberating. It facilitates your human rights, but also it can place you at risk. The genesis at that point of time was the Iranian Green Revolution protests, where people from different parts of society were mobilizing to try to protect democracy, to try to make sure equal voice for folks across gender, and they were using technology, mobile phones and more, to be able to connect, to be able to organize, to share their messages. But many people realized they were actually also placing themselves at risk. Their phones would sometimes be insecure. They would use mechanisms of communication that would actually sometimes facilitate government surveillance and allow for authoritarian backlash and targeting. And so Access Now was actually originally born as a digital security organization.
Right.
To provide digital security help for these activists and others. But soon you realize that it's not just about Iran, it's not just about particular authoritarian contexts. Everywhere, often those who stand up to speak their voices, to challenge those in power, or to hold people to account, are placed at risk. You therefore need to provide digital security support globally, everywhere. And it's not just digital security. This question about how technology you need to make sure that it doesn't place people more at risk is something that needs a public conversation. It needs expert advice to those in power, to those who might become in power, policymakers, the electorate, others as well. And you need to be able to explain how this is going on in simple ways so that everyone in the general public understands.
Right.
And what that means is that today Access Now has several arms of the organization. But
first, Raman, who were the people behind Access Now?
There were several folks. The co-founders of the organization included Brett Solomon, Cameron Ashraf, and several others as well. Essentially, people across Australia and in the wider community, Iran, Iranian Americans, and others. And that was the initial team that got Access Now together.
And who were they? Were like Silicon Valley business people?
No, in fact,
startup?
They were activists fundamentally. They were activists across organization and mobilization in MENA, in Australia. You had people who had helped organize organizations and activist groups elsewhere. You had people who were interested in providing technology. So you had folks who were essentially technologists, digital security nerds or advocates who wanted to get together.
Hackers.
You could say hackers, but not just hackers in many ways. You could say crypto geeks. You could say people when crypto is not about, you could say Bitcoin or currency. It was about encryption, about how can you secure people and what can you do there. And it's those set of people who realize that, you need to be able to provide people these fundamental tools. You need to change how they're looking at things. The sort of community who later, as you know, got so famous when Edward Snowden's revelations came out, right? The people who said, this is how surveillance takes place. This is how you need to secure yourself. The reason why you have Signal on your phone today and so many people have secure messaging through WhatsApp is through the efforts of this community who first said, we need to look at this and care about it.
So what I don't really understand, because as a business journalist, I am not super familiar with the origins of Access Now. And how could a bunch of internet activists gather so much steam and resources and funds from all over the world?
Firstly, it's often through, I would say, hard work and looking at what is the wider problem. And in fact, I would say that was a particular moment in 2009, 2010. There was still this idea of the liberating power of the internet, but starting to recognize the need to look at surveillance, secure communications, and more. You had people interested in the role the internet was playing in democratic change or protest and mobilization, not just, say, in Iran or even the Arab Spring, which was happening then, but across the world. It was a mix of both that sort of, I could say, second phase of internet optimism, while also recognizing how it's important to politics and conversation. And increasingly, as you also seen from then, the internet has become part of every part of society. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's been also the journey of Access Now. It's gone from this sort of effort at providing digital security and initial internet openness advocacy to realizing that tech is impacting everything, and therefore you need a sort of public interest and human rights anchored approach to technology. I would say, in fact, in many ways, we see ourselves as a human rights organization, but in the digital age. We recognize that technology is everywhere, and tech design, tech governance, and even talking about tech needs to come from a human rights perspective, not just from a business perspective or even sometimes the interests of more traditional voices in government. That's what we are.
Right. So I see that because it's in unique timing, 2009, 2010, around the time of color revolution, and also people were realizing for the first time that internet is a great tool for mobilization, but also there could be danger of surveillance and infiltration. Is there anything, Jason, that you would like to add to what kind of organization Access Now is?
I guess our helpline team was always mentioned by different community around the world. That shows how people at risk can be impacted by different applications on the internet or the use of technologies. But at the same time, you also see the needs of digital security support and also the knowledge on what can be harm for you on cyberspace. I think once more and more people realizing this, then people know the value and importance of Access Now as an NGO organization working on this.
Right. So then, so we now know more about Access Now, and I would like to know more about you guys. So Raman, I introduced you as an ex-Googler. Why would you join Access Now? So I guess you were a really brilliant tech engineer. You studied at a really top university and worked at Google. And what brought you to this human rights activism?
Sure. I think sometimes people in the same trajectory as me call themselves Zooglers, although that's a terrible term. Ex-Googler, Zoogler.
Okay.
But in fact, just by background, I'm actually, while I'm a tech geek and enthusiast, I'm actually not an engineer. I trained as a lawyer. I went to one of India's law schools looking at arts and law, and in that's very interested, as always, because I've always been interested in tech and how is technology governed and regulated. And in fact, you realize it's not just about court cases and disputes. It's about not just even the laws that parliaments and governments may pass or regulations that might be there, but that regulation forms the cornerstone of every bit of technology. As we're speaking today, the microphones we're using, the computer that might be recording this, as well as the internet through which people will hear this podcast, are all enabled or governed by different bits of regulation, different bits of law, even just political conversations between actors. Remember, the internet was born as a government project, and that got me very interested in how is the internet governed and regulated, what is the role of public policy in tech. And then I had the opportunity when I was leaving law school to be able to get into, you could say, the candy shop of technology and policy at that time, Google's public policy team. And at a very interesting time and in a very, very interesting location, India, which would be, it's still, even at that time, was the world's second largest internet user base. And that was when it was a much smaller internet user base, but also a very complicated, often contested democracy with interesting conversations around how does the internet impact politics, speech, expression, privacy, and more. And that's what got me in there. But in many ways, that's been what I've been deeply interested in. How are policymakers, regulators, and our elected representatives dealing with or not dealing with governing technology and driving, are they approaching it from a human rights perspective?
What was the experience in India like?
It's super interesting, and I used to have colleagues who used to say, oh, well, what are the issues you're dealing with there in India and Delhi? And I would tell them it's all the issues you're dealing with there in Washington, D.C. or Brussels, but perhaps at 10 times the speed with fewer people, actually. And by fewer people, I mean fewer people working in public policy, think tanks or roles. Again, I would say India's own ecosystem has grown significantly. You have many organizations, experts now there. That's a very good thing to see. I would say I'm happy I've seeded some of them, but I've seen also the space grow much more. But also one where often it'd be contested. You'd have active, interesting public discussions around, say, should the government pass this law making internet platforms responsible for content? The stated purpose would be one thing, but the background context might be an attempt to do political censorship. Given India's unique position and geopolitical conflicts, you'd have disputes or concerns about map depictions. I would sometimes spend tons of time just with Google's map engineers looking at how are India's borders depicted, how is that shown there, how is imagery looked
Always
at.
very controversial.
Yes,
right?
and I don't think there's any part of Asia.
Dash lines. Right. So how come you joined Access Now later?
So, in fact, I think, many people who've been involved in policy and the tech sector saw that wave of initial optimism that, in being in the tech sector, you could help create a new future. You could create something that respected rights, respected openness. And still, I think many people who are in those roles can do that. But definitely, as you've seen, tech, which is now big tech, really has become, like, in a sense, big oil, more conservative, much more careful, much more limited. I would say to me, like, Google in many ways was like a second university, a way to be able to learn lots directly from product managers, engineers, talk to policymakers, understand their concerns. But I wanted to change. I wanted to be able to speak up for these issues more actively. And again, not to say that those who work in corporate roles aren't sometimes in unique, very well-placed positions to do good, but I think I personally thought I could do much more good and be more fulfilled in a more public speaking role on these issues. And that's in fact when I was involved in India Save the Internet campaign soon after I left Google. And at the same time, I had the chance to get to know more about Access Now. And in fact, I joined Access Now because of RightsCon, the conference series we run on technology and human rights, because that was coming to Asia for the first time. And then I joined Access Now to help with that. And a decade afterwards, I'm still there.
Right. It's 10 years from now. And how about you, Jason? 10 years as a journalist.
Right.
And how did you discover Access Now and why did you join?
Yeah, I think as a journalist, my coverage was mainly about human rights and technology and how that also impact politics in different countries and different continents. Then you realize, I published a book on disinformation, which includes stories from 8 countries in 5 years. Then you realize, technology really did harming or impacting every corner in a society. But how to make the change? You don't only need journalists, you need activists. You also need different stakeholders, including policymakers, tech platform, to have so-called roundtable style of conversation and having really honest conversation and further research on all the ongoing topic situation. Then you decide what to do on this. So I cover all these stories and I realized maybe you need to learn something more, like understanding who are the one making all this conversation happen, who are the one pushing the agenda, or what is the way for regional or local partners connect to the global conversation. And that is the approach of Access Now. We provide a platform for activists from Myanmar, from China, from different parts of the world, and then bring their voice to like occasion like United Nations or Europe, different Congress. Then we call it like local to global. I think this is something you can learn and you can observe from organization like Access Now, as well as the event itself of RightsCon. You do see that conversation happen and how people talk to each other, work with each other, making connection and work collectively with different culture or languages, and then dealing the same issue, which is technology and human rights.
Right. And what's your role at Access Now? So you're on the ground in Taiwan, but is your work global or regional or local?
Yeah, I'm a senior policy analyst for East Asia, which cover Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and of course we support our partners in Hong Kong and China, and of course Mongolia as well.
Okay, wow. So it's a big region and very challenging ones, I would say. So I know I introduced the RightsCon as the Burning Man of human rights activism, which Raman agreed with me that it's okay to call it that. But what's RightsCon really? Why did Access Now think it was a good idea to start something like this?
And perhaps again, the origin story has that common link, which is all that it's partly California linked.
Okay.
So RightsCon actually started off as the Silicon Valley Tech and Human Rights Conference, with the idea actually in many ways, and I use the term, it might seem boring, but it's not, but business and human rights. It was a business and human rights project to see, can we get the tech sector, then hubbed in Silicon Valley in the US, now the tech sector is much more global, but that tech sector to realize what are human rights activists across the world facing. It was recognizing that even then the tech sector often used to see itself as linked to civil liberties, considerations around social justice, progress. At least at that point of time, perhaps that's changed. But then they would still speak to folks mostly in the US or elsewhere. They would speak to people in California, perhaps on the West and East Coast, a little bit sometimes in the Americas, in the transatlantic space, not globally. So then, like in a sense, the team at Access Now, which included our co-founder and executive director, Brett Solomon, with many members of the team as well, got together and said, we need to be able to have a conference, a space where activists from across the world can tell the tech sector what are they seeing, what's happening, what can they do better, help them where it's possible, but also challenge them where it's required. And that's what it became. And in many ways, that started off as a small conference, the Silicon Valley Tech and Human Rights Conference, and now has become RightsCon, which in many ways is the main global tech and human rights convening. There are many other events and occasions that take place, but RightsCon is perhaps a little bit, or at least we sometimes believe that it's a bit unique in its scale and in the different type of stakeholders and participants you have there. And it's now a regular periodic conference series. Earlier it used to be every year. We've increased a little bit the planning cycle, so it now happens around every 18 months or so across different locations in the world, and it convenes the world's community on digital rights, but also the wider human rights community, activists from the grassroots to the local, regional and international, as Jason was talking about, but folks from government, people from intergovernmental institutions, the tech sector, not just the Western tech sector or big tech, but startups, tech actors across the world, Asian, Latin American, African tech groups, scholars, activists, and more. So it's an incredible space where you have perhaps rock stars in this space, but you also have people who are every day under threat or every day being able to challenge authoritarianism in interesting ways. And they all come together to talk and meet, both in public-facing sessions and programs. And just to give you a sense of that, for the next RightsCon that's coming up, we have nearly 500 sessions happening across, around
how many days?
Around 4 days total.
4 days.
Like, counting a little bit of preparatory time.
So you don't
before.
Sleep.
Some people don't sleep. I encourage people to sleep during RightsCon. And this is happening often in parallel sessions. So we don't do just like one big main stage or keynotes. We have 8 to sometimes 15 sessions happening in parallel, more traditional open discussions to closed workshops to private meetings to tech talks to, in fact, interactive game exercises depending on what's going on there. And the best thing about RightsCon is not even the programming, although I hope people come and listen to the sessions. It's the people you meet in the corridors. You will see the general counsel of a tech company talking to an activist from a country.
That's where I'll be, the corridors.
Absolutely. An interesting
Not
conversation.
in the auditorium. All right, so what can we expect from the coming RightsCon in Taipei? So perhaps Jason can give us a taste.
Yeah, we always have like updates in the process of planning the events because we do see more and more proposals in the way that people are trying to do something in that week in Taipei. So in terms of maybe we start with numbers, the participants we are seeing right now can reach to 3,500 or 4,000 join in person.
Wow.
It's not virtually. And that include government officials, representative of tech companies globally, but also regionally. Then, of course, activists, civil society, experts, academics as well. So you do see like the community, global community are really coming to Taipei, to the region. And that's where all this conversation can happen. I mean, we hope there will be more East Asia partners coming for these events so that they can directly talk to our partners from the globe. And that's what people are hoping to, having this conversation to understand like what is the strategy here in Taiwan, in Korea, in Japan, with the companies or with the civil society. What is the direction of policy are going? So they want to talk to the government officials. That's something you can expect in these 4 days. And that's 4 days for the conference itself. But of course, we do have side events. So maybe 3 days before the conference, you do see already side event are planning. So I would say it's a whole week of gathering, global gathering in Taipei. And these people are the one working hard to defend our digital rights. But at the same time, they are the one who have the conversation about what can be done to have better digital policy or better digital tools because there are companies coming as well.
Right. And there will be a Burning Man somewhere in the audience, right?
And then parties, of course.
Yes, there will be a lot of parties, I'm sure. Right. So it's really, I should say that as someone who is based in Taipei, this is exciting because just 5 years ago, I couldn't imagine something like this taking place in Taipei. We probably could imagine this would happen in Singapore, Hong Kong, or Tokyo, but not in Taipei. So really says something about our changing world. So we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we will talk about the significance of having RightsCon in Taipei. Welcome back to the Taiwanology podcast. This is your host, Liu Guangying from Taipei's CommonWealth magazine. Today we have two perfect guests in the studio. Raman Singh Chima, he is the Senior International Counsel and Asia-Pacific Policy Director at Access Now, and Jason, who is the Senior Analyst of Access Now, the East Asia region. So, right, we were just talking about the upcoming RightsCon. That's what I say is the Burning Man of human rights activism. And could you, Raman, tell us the significance of having RightsCon in Taipei? I think it's the first time ever.
Yes, and so let me answer that in two ways. Firstly, by talking about why the Asia-Pacific region and why Taipei in Asia. Firstly, just as important, the Asia-Pacific region is one of the most important spots when it comes to technology and what's happening to technology in governance, geopolitics, and regulation globally. I often explain to people it's not about the future of the internet being in Asia, it's the present of the internet. The majority of the world's internet users are located in this region, particularly given the large population bases of China, India, but also Indonesia and more. You see, as you know, so much tech manufacturing happening mostly in Asia across different parts of this region. You see design happening in this region across many hubs. Again, like looking at the Silicon Valleys of India, Thailand, Indonesia, Taiwan itself, Korea, and more. And you see also the role of financing and funding from this region shaping how global tech is happening. You see governments from this region creating policies and laws that impact every place. So this is the present of the internet, and therefore this is one of the key spots to being RightsCon, to enable also all these people from Asia to more easily be able to come to this sort of event. Why Taipei? I mean, very simple. One, Taipei Taipei itself has become, particularly over the last few years, a key hub for conversations around society, democracy, politics, governance, and more. This is my 7th or nearly 8th trip to Taipei, and that's because so many interesting conversations are happening here. From internet governance, which has now held 2 forums, 2 meetings in Taipei over the last few months, to many other conversations around human rights, around democracy, around even cybersecurity and strategy. And in that way, Taipei and Taiwan as a whole is become a key hub and convening spot to discuss these topics in the region, part of Taiwan's own rich commitment to democracy and discussion, out of also its often contested and passionate past. So the Taipei and Taiwan of today is shaped by the challenges, the protests and others that have occurred in Taiwan over the last few years. And that's such a rich story for activists, and I personally find it interesting. The other reason, of course, for Taipei is critical is that Taipei is welcoming of these discussions. It is very crucial for a human rights conference at the scale that we're at to come to a location that welcomes activists, welcomes people like that. Because actually, as you discussed in the Asia-Pacific region, there are very few spots to have an honest, open conversation around human rights and technology. People will say, you can talk about other countries, please don't talk about ours. We welcome the fact that in Taiwan, people are so willing to talk openly about not just what's happening in the region or internationally, but even their own happy things and their own challenges. So that's why we're very happy to be here, and also because people have welcomed us here.
Right. And I think these are all good points. And I think another perspective is also there also many challenges to human rights and technology happening around a few countries around Asia Pacific. For example, Myanmar and Thailand, there's maybe crackdown or censorship that's also going on. So I think those will be also a focus of discussion. So Jason, what do you think as the guy who is responsible for her making this happen? What's the significance that RightsCon is happening in Taiwan?
Yeah, of course, it's a team's effort. It's just I'm based here and talking to our key partners. I think 2 things about RightsCon having here in Taipei and what is crucial for us, for the global community, and for the partners here to have this conversation with RightsCon. I think first, we all know the civil society in Taiwan. They are very active, but at the same time, they are keen to be connected to global conversation and community, given the recent challenges in recent years. And I think more and more of Taiwanese partners, civil society partners, they realize that actually their experience, their insights, their knowledge learned from their own projects or from the history of Taiwan are actually valuable to the global community. And we do see more and more global partners, they are inspired when they listen to the stories from Taiwan or when they read the history of Taiwan. They think there's a connection over there. But given the situation like geopolitics or political reality, there is maybe a gap in the past between Taiwanese community and the global one. So bringing RightsCon here, I think, to fill that gap, to make this exchange happen, is crucial for the global community to learn what the experience or lessons from this region, but as well as to help the Taiwanese community to connect it to the global one. I think that's very timely reason why we are having this. Secondly, Taiwan happened to be the most experienced spot, I think, in the region, given the cyberspace activities as well as activism on cyberspace. So in terms of having all the experience from cyber attack, on the other side, how to mobilize your own citizens, civil society as a way to defend human rights with technology. I think those are also crucial experience which can be really interesting and valuable to the global conversation. So RightsCon happened in Taipei. We do see lots of excitement from our global community, as well as we are having strong support from local partners, from civil society, from government officials. At the same time, we are seeing more and more support or interest from private sector to join RightsCon because they want to connect to our global community and contribute in the discussion.
Right. So these are great points. And I also think you mentioned something that that really resonates with my experience. I think in the past, the people in Taiwan or the civil society or the people, they sometimes feel that we're marginalized or on the margin and nobody wants to hear from us. But if we really step outside, we could really share our experience and realize that actually the experience of what we're doing in Taiwan could be a good lesson for other people. And also we could learn from each other. And I think that this is something that people in Taiwan need to recognize more and more. And so I have to bring up this topic of geopolitical situation. So that's Taiwan's situation. And how do you think our unique situation could influence our approach to digital rights and governance?
And firstly, as you mentioned, that sort of like the areas of conflict and geopolitical tension that Taiwan often finds itself in has shaped its experience on cyberspace, as Jason mentioned. And that cyberspace experience and expertise is something that many governments, many stakeholders, civil society and others are keen on. They're keen to learn, saying, what are you seeing, for example, when it comes to authoritarian action online? What do you see in terms of issues about disinformation? But also, do you see how do you build global connections in an area of sometimes contestation or political change? Taiwan's ability to be such a global tech hub, not just in terms of hosting tech discussions here, but in many ways powering global tech, is something people want to learn from. They want to understand what's going on in that. How do you balance considerations of what's happening in East Asia, Taiwan's relationship with mainland China and more? Mm-hmm. That is something that people do want to learn from and understand. But also there, Taiwan's role in doing this while trying to be a committed democracy is something that so many folks want to come and learn from more and look at. I think it's very important to know that the world is going through significant change. Even what we took to be assumptions a few months earlier, we are now in an even different political environment. You see political change across so many countries. You see, attempted, martial law efforts in parts of Asia. You've seen ongoing, but perhaps rapidly failing military coups in other parts in Southeast Asia. You see democratic change, or sometimes, the rise of parties with strong views in many parts of Europe and the United States. So everything is changing, and I think people are keen to understand from Taiwan what it's seen in terms of its own history of change. How is it able to talk about these issues in a space where often it does encounter people who don't want it to speak up on particular issues, to share its experiences? But ultimately, the main thing Taiwan has to share are its people. The experiences and talents of its people are what most people are drawn by. I've been struck by the fact that so many activist colleagues in the region often work with partners in Taiwan, want to learn from them, understand or collaborate, and that is perhaps the most important thing that Taiwan can bring to actors across the world. People want to work with and learn from Taiwanese colleagues.
Right. And I think people would also be curious who would be the rockstar speakers in RightsCon. Could you give us a taste of that?
For sure, and I keep emphasizing to people, don't just go by star lineups. We have a great website. You'll see many of the people that are there. And you will hear from fantastic folks like, say, Meredith Whittaker, the person who organized the Google walkouts, an incredible thinker on AI, and who's now the president of Signal Foundation, the foundation, a not-for-profit that runs the app that so many activists, government actors
Signal.
and others depend on. But also the Signal protocol powers WhatsApp, which is the secure messaging app that millions use, and so many businesses use as well. You'll see people coming who have directly challenged oppression and authoritarianism in their own countries or spoken up for the rights of women across borders. You'll have, for example, Nigat Tad, the founder and director of Digitalized Foundation Pakistan. You will see activists coming from across Western Africa, Eastern Africa. You'll see tech actors, but I'll pause and I could go on and more and more rock stars.
Right.
But it's most interesting to see the people, as I said, who are there in the corridors.
Right.
Yeah, if I can jump in.
Yeah.
I think other than the names people are expecting as rock stars, I would say you can look into our program. You will see lots of interesting conversation, like the topic of the panel or the workshops. It's never you can have in Taiwan before.
You do see some examples.
You do see media outlets from Russia, from Syria, from Iranian, from Ukraine, and Taiwan. They are speaking together in one session, talking about what is the journalism's future within conflict zone. Or you do see activists from Belarus, from Ukraine, from China, from Hong Kong, talking about how to campaign on cyberspace. And you do see people from Japan, Korea, and also other parts of the world from Europe talking about data protection policy, what's the trend, what are difference, how we learn from each other. You don't really have to look into the names of those people it's already you're so excited because this conversation is not something you can have in other events. So I would really encourage people come and join this conversation, then provide your perspective, because RightsCon is a place people co-learning, co-create, and then make connection.
And I just want to say, it's interesting to me to see activists having honest discussions around how do we mobilize, how do we fundraise, how do we survive in a world where, for example, space is shrinking, civic space is shrinking, the space for activism is reducing right when you need more activists out there. And you see them sharing, rubbing shoulders with cyber ambassadors, for example. At the last RightsCon in Costa Rica, we had 13 ambassadors, national security officials from different countries who lead on cybersecurity policy, who represent their governments in the UN and elsewhere coming. You will see people talking about AI and how to regulate it, not just from activists and academics, but government officials, tech actors, including those perhaps who want less regulation of AI or those who believe AI is an existential threat, being in the same room together. So it's a very unique set of folks there. And RightsCon in many ways is a platform. It's what you make of it. And we're very glad that so many people not just use it, but are so particularly excited to be here in Taipei.
Right. So yeah, I think Jason really summed it up really, really nicely. It's not just about the named speakers, but it's a unique platform where people from different interests or perspectives can come together to share their views and even debate, because it's an open platform. And so anyone can join. Do you have to be an activist to sign up?
You have to register. So you do have to register online, get a ticket. You have to pay for the ticket, but we ensure that people who are especially activists or for whom, for example, resources are a challenge are not restrained. We keep saying that registration should not be a barrier to entry. So anyone can be there. We obviously do try to make sure it's a safe space. So we welcome people from a wide variety of backgrounds, stakeholder groups. So as I said, activists, civil society, academics, people who may not be speaking, but people who just want to listen are absolutely welcome. We see lots of students coming to RightsCon as well. There's also a youth summit. And the only thing we just do is make sure that it's a safe space for activists. It's not anyone there who might cause people to feel threatened or uncomfortable. But with that basic check, we ensure it's as wide as possible. Of the 4,500 people or 4,000 people we expect to be here, many will be people who are also just watching and listening.
Right. So it's a 4-day event taking place in what venue?
TICC, Taipei 国际会议中心.
Okay,
and also you can join virtually if you are not attending the parties or having a conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can try to navigate yourself among the 500 links, which session and I'm going to join. Right. So when does the registration close?
I'll try to check and get back to you on that.
Okay, maybe a few days before the event?
I think so.
It does. We normally close, and just like speaking frankly, normally what happens is that we close online registration, around a week or so, or like sometimes 10 days before the event. But then we also have a limited amount of on-site registration.
Walk-ins welcome.
Walk-ins to some capacity are welcome, but I'd say it's often easier for people who say might be there to cover the event, who are journalists and others, again, to check in. But there is a process. But let me get back to you on that and recheck.
Right. So our listeners, whether you are in Taiwan or you're in other place, you could register and choose to participate in RightsCon, whether remotely or in person. So, well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time today. That has been a pleasure to meet you guys.
It's a pleasure to be here in Taipei.
Thank you for having us.
And looking forward to meeting you guys again at RightsCon in February, just in a few weeks, actually.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe at the corridors, not in those conference rooms.
Yeah. See you there.
See you.
Good. So that wraps up today's episode. If you enjoyed this podcast, please take a moment to leave a review or shoot us an email. To read more in-depth reports on Taiwan, please visit CommonWealth English website. Our next episode will be available February 25th. This show is produced and edited by Zhang Yayuan and Wang Weiru. I'm your host, Liu Kwangyin. Follow Taiwanology wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.